ready! Ahoy!
My introduction to GreedFall was a little less than standard for me. Normally I go in actually knowing something about the game. You know, I tend to go in with at least some understanding of what it is, or, you know, I have an understanding of what it is through its reputation, or just in its genre, or whatever. My introduction to this one, a little less than normal. I was trawling through the Xbox One sales for the week like I normally do, and I saw it was on sale. And I promptly started laughing because I thought, hey, this is that game that had that really, really awful box art, right? Actually, no, it turns out it wasn't. That was Planetfall, and this is the box art. For some reason, they actually changed their box art, but this is the one I was talking about, and holy crap, this is terrible box art. Not the point. Going back to the forums that I was looking at, a lot of people were suggesting this was sort of like the best game for this week on sale, saying it was an amazing B-grade RPG. And, you know, the thing about me is, I loves me my games that can be played with roles. And I especially love B-grade RPGs, because with AAA releases, you typically have an idea of what you're going to get. You're going to have something with a ridiculously huge marketing budget that overhypes the game and is usually not quite as good as it ever tries to pretend to be. With B-grade RPGs, it is just the Wild West of games. You don't know what you're getting, but it's always interesting. So I was immediately enamored with what this game could be. In fact, it kind of reminded me a little bit of my situation with Outward last year. I hadn't heard about it until like 6 months after its release, and then the moment I heard about it, I made it my life goal to try and own a copy by the end of the day. Well, it's the same with this one. And I gotta admit, my feelings towards this game are kind of complicated. The story features you, known only by their surname, Desardet, probably because this is a French game, but also because they want to refer to your character in the voice acting while still acknowledging your character's modifications and customization. Your character, the legate of the Congregation of Merchants. Now, if that means absolutely nothing to you, that's fine. Basically, it means you're a big shot. Not so much a big shot, mind you, that you have to sit around bored all day not going on adventures. Unfortunately, your cousin gets saddled with that role, but big enough that if you mention your title, everyone typically crumples around your will. Now, you and your cousin are about to go colonize basically the New World. You are representing the Congregate of Merchants, which in this world is basically the equivalent of Switzerland. There's a lot of war going around your country, but you remain mostly neutral. And don't worry if you're gonna forget all that, because it has pretty much no bearing on the game as a whole. Like, seriously, your entire status pre-New World is basically pointless. Which is kind of a shame, because as the fictional universe equivalent of Switzerland, you could have probably won friends with every single person by giving them kick-ass watches, awesome knives, and delicious, delicious chocolate. Unfortunately, in this game, all you have is words, bullets, and magic to do your bidding. But the nice thing is, because you are basically a neutral party, you can go into pretty much any hostile situation and talk your way out of it, which is a nice feature. Now, going to the New World, your job in colonizing the New World is one of three. The first is just colonizing, you know, expanding your territory, making sure that your colonies are happy. Simple enough. The second one is making friends with the people around you. You are not exactly the only country out there trying to colonize this world. You've got both warring countries that surround yours trying to claim this new world as well, and as a neutral party, you have to kind of come together to at least try and make things a little bit more peaceful in the new world, as well as trying to not pick fights with the native population. More on that in a minute. And finally, arguably your most important, from a personal perspective, goal is to find a cure for a disease that is ravaging your home nation. One that has no cure, and one that is rapidly spreading and killing off numerous people, most notably your mother. And there's your personal stake in this story. Now, going back a step, I mentioned the native population of this game, and they're a pretty big deal in the overarching narrative here. Unfortunately, the way they're utilized, combined with the fact that this is colonial era, pretty much means that if you've ever seen a story like this, you know where it's going. Unfortunately, this is very much a Fern Gully Avatar Dances with Wolves sort of thing, where you kind of see all the colonies trying to steamroll the native population to use all the resources they possibly can, albeit in slightly different ways. For example, your people are just trying to expand and see the new world. You've got another group that is more or less science-minded and trying to explore, all the different ways you could ultimately find cures for things, as well as exploring the biology and flora and fauna of this new world. And then, of course, you've got one other group, which are basically this game's equivalent of Catholics, who are trying to basically convert the entire population to their religion. Or, as this game likes to not so kindly put it, praising the sun. Yeah, for some reason this game takes shots at Dark Souls, which is pretty gutsy considering that that's a much better RPG than this one. And if the entire native population gets completely steamrolled for heresy at the hands of this religion's inquisitors, well, it was just because they couldn't quite get good. But I find it a little bit sad that this game tries to go for just the simple, colonizing a new world is really, really bad for the native population route, because it's kind of an obvious story and they're not subtle about it. It does feel a little bit preachy at times. I think one nice thing about the story that sort of counteracts how heavy-handed the key themes are is the main character of Desarde himself. He comes across as a very mild-mannered, very even-handed person who's pushed by tragedy to motivate his actions, but he's never greedy about what he does. He feels like he's constantly trying to achieve his goals, but try and do it in a way that benefits everyone, as opposed to kind of everyone else around him who is more or less in it for themselves, or at least for their, main banner that they're flying. He's just there to try and do the nice thing and try and make sure that people are safe and healthy, and that's his big motivation. And I think that makes him a relatively good, relatable protagonist in a story that's very heavy-handed. It makes it feel a little bit less so, all while having the advantage of giving your character sort of an outsider's perspective on sort of all the different factions of this world, as he is inherently a neutral sort of intermediary party. And if nothing else, it makes the protagonist fairly likable. Now that's not where I want to end talking about the story, but I do have to move on because this is going to come back later. Let's move on to the gameplay, because gameplay in this game is complicated. Not in the sense that it's overly complex or anything, just in the sense that there's a lot going on that isn't necessarily good or bad. Like I said, this is a B-grade RPG, and, well, it feels like it here for sure. Now, in combat, you have three major ways to attack your opponent. You have melee attacks, magic, and ranged attacks. Let's hold off on the innovation there, guys. We need to save some of that innovation for the next game. And combat feels very, very generally clunky. In melee combat, it feels like there's a bit of a delay between individual attacks, and hitboxes feel very, very chunky and wonky. I remember fighting the first boss of the game using my sword, and feeling like I was standing about a whole person away from me and my opponent's attack and still getting hit by it somehow. That wasn't exactly great, and that's when I learned a little trick about combat. See, the thing about this game, and the fact that it's set in colonial era, means that most human enemies, and the fact that you're going up against a lot of just wildlife, a lot of them are just using melee attacks, with their swords, or in the case of wildlife, their claws or fangs. And you know what's ridiculously powerful against melee attacks? A gun. Yeah, there are guns in this game, and they completely wreck shop. I feel like they tried to balance this out a little bit in the sense that bullets are a manageable resource, but the thing is you can craft them ridiculously easy with very easy to find materials. I think at no point did I ever have less than 100 bullets on me once I discovered how amazing guns were. And the only other thing that kind of is a drawback to guns is they're not great against armored targets. But the thing is, if you invest in building up your gun skills in your skill tree, you unlock bombs, which require no materials to use. They hit wide ranges of enemies, they completely destroy armor, and oh yeah, they also poison all your enemies. So if it doesn't outright kill your enemies, it's gonna leave them so bloody crippled that you can double tap the problem from an entire colonial battleship away. Seriously, combat in this game is not balanced whatsoever, and gunplay in this game just completely wrecks the difficulty. I'm gonna make no bones about it, this is on the hardest difficulty ever. And the only times I died were in the tutorial when I was still faffing around with a sword. And honestly, that was quite a challenge. But I got completely destroyed by the boss because, again, hardest difficulty, and I decided to experiment with the gun. And then I realized, oh yeah, my enemy can't actually hit me from this far away, and I could just keep backpedaling and completely destroying them. And then once you unlock the bombs, there's literally no problem your gun and its support skill of bombs can't solve. You can even get an honest-to-God 6-shooter so that you just take out entire rooms of enemies just with bullets. It is ridiculously unbalanced for reasons I can't quite fathom. And it's completely bizarre. There's also a magic system. I invested a little bit in this, but really I only ever utilized one skill, the one that completely stops your opponent for a brief period of time while eroding their armor. And I only invested in this so I could deal with armor before I unlocked the bomb skill. It's great for giving yourself a breather and recouping your team, but magic, it'll give you a ranged attack, so I mean, it's still probably overpowered compared to melee, but still it's weird. But sticking to melee in this game, I feel like that's picking an extra hard mode because, again, the hitboxes feel a little bit chunky and clumsy, and while there is an evasion and there is a counter system, it's a very, very basic one. Countering is just a matter of pressing a button and boom, you've countered. Although if you start countering multiple opponents at once, you're probably going to get overwhelmed rather quickly. And this isn't a problem, again, if you deal with the problem from the other side of the room with a gun. This game is not well balanced. Combat-wise, you can also pause the game at times and make it sort of a slower, more tactical thing, kind of similar to, say, the earlier Dragon Age games. This was a feature I didn't use very much because, again, I had a gun and literally nothing was challenging whatsoever. You're going to be running into a lot of standard human enemies, as well as like bears and wolves. However, what's really cool about this game are the Guardians. They are usually, as their name would indicate, guarding certain areas around the world and are pretty rare to run into, but they are these huge, like, wooden giants and creatures that are like part like natural environment, part creature. It is fascinating to fight them, and they are intimidating as all hell. Unfortunately, they go down pretty quick to bullets too, and there's only like 4 or 5 different types, which is kind of a shame because they were absolutely the highlight of combat in this game. They were just so fascinating to fight, and they really did end up making this world feel a lot more unique and a lot more fantastical than my initial assumptions as to what this game were. They were a real surprise. Outside of that, this game actually quite impressed me in some regards as to how to handle various challenges. In fact, it reminded me a little bit of Deus Ex. Many of the various quests can be handled through multiple routes, using your various skills, your knowledge to go through various text trees, the ability to fight in pretty much any situation if it really devolves down to it. You can usually talk yourself out of pretty much any problem you ever run into, and by playing diplomatically that way, you end up being best friends with literally everyone. Weirdly enough, your own team, the Congregate of Merchants, for some reason aren't immediately friendly to you, and that's a little peculiar, but otherwise you can be just best friends with everyone. And as a colonial intermediary force, I mean, I guess that's sort of the whole point. But that said, there's usually alternate routes to clear through any quest, and many quests end up having callbacks to previous ones. I remember running through this one quest and talking about how, okay, well, I sided with this one group, which, for what it's worth, I didn't feel like I sided with them at any point, but I don't want to necessarily, go against that and make them angry with me, but I managed to talk everything out and it was fine. But alternatively, in another quest, I could talk someone into giving me an item, or I could give them a sleeping potion so they fall asleep and I can just grab it from them. Or I can, sneak around them, or, get my hands dirty and just start shooting people. There's lots of different solutions to every quest in this game, and that definitely rewards multiple playthroughs and multiple playstyles. There feels like there isn't one specific way to play this game. Unless you play melee, in which case you're playing objectively wrong and you should get a gun as quickly as possible. One thing I found really peculiar about this game, though, was the leveling system. Like, don't get me wrong, leveling up in this game is the same as anything else. You get experience, you get enough, you level up, hooray. But after you level, you have to allocate skill points. Simple enough. You start by selecting stuff like, okay, well, I want to go through this tree and select my next ability, which in my case would be improving my gun, to ultimately building up bombs. And the nice thing is, every chunk of this skill tree, from melee weapons with like one-handed knives to two-handed weapons, magic, guns, what have you, they all intersect with each other, and at the points of intersection they end up getting like new super abilities. Like there's a tree of trap building, and that eventually intersects with the guns to give us the amazing bomb skills, and you can ultimately use like the really strong beefy warrior tree, mix that with the magic tree to ultimately learn a healing spell. There's a lot of just intersection between these skill trees, and it's really fascinating to see how they ultimately build up on one another. But here's where things get a little peculiar, because that's only one of 3 trees to customize your character. You also have a tree for passively building up your character outside of combat, and then you've got one that sort of focuses on their passive combat skills. Between those two, as well as your active combat skills or your abilities, it just becomes a little bit weird. And what's especially weird is you don't gain a point for each tree every level. You gain a point for your active in-game combat skills every level, and then the passive ones are like every 3 or 4 levels, and it's really inconsistent. I find that very, very peculiar, especially if you want to try and manage your character's overall build and what you ultimately want to make your character. Because you know you're going to get 1 combat skill point every level. Okay, but when's the next time I get a point to the thing that lets me get better charisma stats so that I can talk my way out of combat more often? Or when's the level up where I get the passive ability to my gun damage that lets me hold better guns? Don't get me wrong, the game will outright tell you when you get these new skill points, but the fact that they sort of independently give you specialized points asynchronously just makes sort of planning out your character a lot more tedious than it should be. And you can't exactly trade your combat skill points for the other passive buff points, which is a shame because by the end of it you have so many active skill points that are just unused, and you're just banging your head against a wall, desperately trying to get experience, trying to get the next skill points to your passives. It's a little frustrating. You know, it's like every 1 level you get 1 skill, every 3 you'll get the second one plus that one, and like every 4th one you'll get another one. So outside of like levels divisible by 12, you're never going to get the ability to level up all 3 chunks of your character. Because at level 29, I only have like 7 talent points, and I have like 10 attribute points, but I have 29 skill points. And the thing is, the game gives skill points out like candy. Like I said, you get 1 every level, but you can also just find them in the world. And at level 29, I had like 15 left over that I just had nothing to do with. And granted, that's because I invested in the guns, and, well, as we've established, more guns is more funds. You don't need anything else at that point, sure. But it feels like you should be able to, like, convert some of these excess skill points that you don't necessarily need into passive outside of combat attributes buffs, or passive out of combat talent buffs. But that's not an option, and that's really weird, especially given how inconsistent the leveling is in this game, or at least the points you get for doing so. Now that said, you can reset your character if you're unhappy with their build, but you have to use a very rare item, and when I say very rare, I mean there's like 5 in the game, and while the game gives you 1 at the start, the rest have to be sought out, and they're not easy to find by any means or measure. So you kind of have to at least have a general understanding of how you want to play this game before you really go in and delve deep down. For example, I could tell you that it's pointless to really ever go in and put any passive talent points into charisma, because with 1 point in charisma, and you get that just from 1 piece of equipment that you will always have equipped anyway, you can pretty much pass any charisma check. Granted, it might take some save scumming. You would have no reason to ever put in any points into blacksmithing because you can just pay for a blacksmith to customize your stuff for you. Lockpicking is pretty much pointless to put any points into because pretty much every box in the game, the key is literally in the direct vicinity of it. So the only things really worth putting any passive talent points into is crafting to make better bullets, and getting past specific things that require you to create bombs to explode walls. And the game actually requires that, so you need to put a point in that. Pretty much all the talent points you need other than science is just putting it into things that let you unlock different paths to explore. And for some reason, I need to put in passive points so that my character can walk across a balance beam. I find that a little odd. Now, one thing I want to talk about this game is the exploration to this game, because when I looked at this game, especially like through some trailers and some other stuff I saw before I decided to buy it, I kind of thought this was going to be like a big open world game, and it's really not. What it is a series of smaller hub areas that connect to other areas, and these smaller hub areas are usually made up of mostly smaller individual corridors. Yes, there are wider areas where you can explore a little bit, but there are oftentimes little ravines you have to walk through to connect to slightly bigger parts of the more open-worldy hub bits. I think it would have been nice to see a giant open world, but I think that the map overall to this game works pretty well. Although going back to abilities for just a sec, I still find it a little bit peculiar that you need to put in some, like, passive traits to actually explore some of this world. And very rarely is it ever worthwhile. You'll sometimes find like some really low-level randomized loot or something that makes it feel really wildly not worthwhile. It's inconsistent, I don't like that, but the world as a whole, both in terms of map design as well as just the world period, is pretty fantastic. I love the world of GreedFall quite a lot. Another thing I'd like to note is, while there are tons of fast travel points in this world, and every hub has usually 3 or 4, traveling to different hubs leads immediately to a loading screen. Now that's fine, I get it, okay. But then that loading screen leads to a camp screen where you have to wander around and waste time in order to then progress to another loading screen that's even longer if you happen to not just sit around and buy stuff at the merchant to kill time, to then finally go to your place. It's just a little weird that you have to basically go through 2 loading screens and then a loading screen you can play, rather than just going to 1 loading screen. It seems excessive and pointless, and I just wanted to point out how weird the transition between areas is in this game. But let's keep talking about other things in this game in terms of gameplay, because there are a few other options to trying to complete your quest other than building out the best combat character or talking around things. Because there is stealth in this game, and stealth in this game, as a fan of stealth, it hurts a lot. So there's 2 types of stealth in this game, and I have to appreciate that they tried to tackle both sides of stealth. First of all, you've got the standard overt sneaking around type of stealth, and that in this game basically devolves into don't stand 2 feet in front of any enemy and you will never be seen. The enemy detection in this game is terrible. Lighting, sound, proximity, none of it really affects anything. So long as you don't stand within like 5 feet directly in front of anyone for more than 5 seconds, no one's ever going to actually fight you for being detected. It is really easy to be a ghost in this game. So that kind of stealth is kind of awful. On the other hand, they also tried to tackle social stealth, in the sense that there are several different factions in this game, and you can blend in and sneak around them if you wear the right clothes as a disguise. Now this is a cool idea. I've seen it in a few games, and I always love when it's done right, but this time it feels like someone came up with that idea, and someone else just said, yeah, let's add it, and then they didn't do anything with it, because despite the fact that there's like half a dozen different factions in this game, only 3 areas in the game, as far as I remember, were actually ever flagged as an area that a faction was in control of. And if you walked in, you'd get in trouble, and they'd attack you. And the thing is, those 3 areas are all controlled by the exact same group of people. As long as you go around wearing an outfit from the Seafaring Knots, you will never have to ever change your outfit ever, because you'll be able to just go in anywhere, because the 3 areas in the game that are like locked to a faction are all theirs. It's a little bit bizarre. I appreciate that they tried to add some sort of stealth, both social and the sort of standard sneaking around kind, but neither really work. I commend them for trying, but they need to do a lot more to make this functional. And this is why I kind of had to go back to story for a minute. Because thinking about this review and what I want to say in particular, I ended up thinking, you know, what about this do I like? Because the 2 big things in me for games are mechanics and the story. And the story to this game is a very basic thing. You can kind of see most of the big plot points a mile away, and it's not subtle about it, nor is it super well told. And combat is basically just shoot thing with a gun a whole bunch, and talk your way out of anything that you can't shoot your way out of. And neither of those are particularly good, and yet I had an absolute blast with this game, so what was it? And certainly part of it is me just enjoying just sort of a average combat system, sure, but I think I've really nailed it down. And it's threefold. First of all is the world this game sets up, because this game is set in sort of a colonial, age of exploration type of era, and I love that sort of thing. It's not a very often used setting, I don't think. And the thing about this setting is, it was great from a human exploration standpoint. You know, we explored every chunk of land we were physically connected to, and we didn't find any crazy dragons or giant monsters or anything, but maybe those new lands on the horizon, maybe that's where all the dragons are. And because this game also happens to take place in a slightly fictionalized version of sort of human history. There might possibly be dragons on the horizon, and spoilers, there are some monsters out there and they're pretty awesome. They go down really easy with a gun, but still pretty awesome. The second thing I really liked about this game were the characters, because this is a game where you end up sort of amassing a crew of friends that really end up getting built up around you as you adventure. Each one of these characters has a fairly deep and involved quest tree that usually has breaks in between bigger plot points, and it really does feel like you naturally go through and learn more about these characters and end up bonding with. You know, you end up feeling actually closer to these characters. They're actually pretty well written. And as opposed to the greater overall story, they're actually a little bit less obviously written than you might necessarily initially believe. My best example right now would be Father Petrus. He is more or less one of the, again, basically proxy Catholic type guys. And when I immediately saw that, as someone who's not overly religious, I kind of groaned a little bit, because again, they're all very sort of overt in what they're doing here. Like, they're sending out inquisitors that are just killing people who aren't immediately converting to their Dark Souls pro player get good culture. And I immediately thought that's what this guy was, and I could not be more wrong. Like, his religion is like 2% of his character. Most of the rest of it is just him being like this really sly political maneuverer who's trying to get up in the world and like digging up dirt on all of these like really like big famous people, just so that he can use that as some sort of like way to gain better favor and higher positions in the future. This guy, you know, I went in thinking, I'm gonna hate this guy. I don't like these kind of like overly religious types of characters, especially when they're not subtly written. And again, this game doesn't exactly do that subtly. This character I'm never gonna use. He ended up being one of my favorites. All of these characters are more than simply one-note, single personality traits that you can ultimately romance for an achievement or whatever down the line. These characters actually feel like characters, and I love that. There's actual organic growth in your relationships with them. Granted, it feels like it's a little bit accelerated because this game isn't quite as long as I think it could be, but still, they grow really well. And they have some really great quests associated with them, especially if you drag them on other quests where their knowledge might be relevant. For example, an early party member you get is good old Captain Vasco, and he is one of the nautical sailor guys. And these guys are quite mysterious because they have this like magic that allows them and only them to control the sea and let them safely cross the sea, because no one else is allowed to be a sailor because they're just the only ones that have this nautical magic, hence their name, the Nauts. And you actually end up going in and digging down on their history with him, and he actually like explains some of it, and it's genuinely well written. Going back to the world they wrote is a deep and interesting world. It feels like they've put a lot of thought into this world. It feels like their story is a little bit lofty compared to the world they've written, and that's a damn shame, which leads me to the third thing I absolutely liked about it, which is this game is just incredibly well written. Again, once you kind of ignore the major chunks of the main plot, because each of these characters just feels deep. You kind of dig into like their path in life and sort of who they are and the faction that they support. It's really cool to learn about this stuff and the world around them. Like I said, Vasco's quests and learning more about his people and like the fact that people actively sacrifice people to them just to appease them so that they can continue to sail out there and make a huge profit off it. It was genuinely very fascinating. This is an incredibly well-written world. I just don't know why they went with such an obvious story for like the whole main quest. Because while the combat is lacking, the actual quest progression, not so much. And while the story is seriously lacking, the actual writing, the world, the setting, the mythos, and the characters are all incredibly fascinating. This game has some absolutely brilliant writing. Once you get past the main quest at best is average, but damn, the writing in this game is good. And that's ultimately what I loved about this game, I think. Like, the combat and all the mechanics, yeah, that's okay, but the writing as a whole was just engrossing. You know, oftentimes in RPGs, I will skip lots and lots of text just because I don't want to read it all, and even though I knew kind of where the main story was going a lot of the time, I couldn't bring myself to skip any text boxes. Yeah, the dialogue is sort of your standard Mass Effect, go through a standard dialogue tree asking about every sort of thing of importance in a dialogue, and then, you know, say I'm done talking with you, and yet it was still really fascinating. I don't think you necessarily want to buy GreedFall for its mechanics, but if you want a really interesting story and a really fantastic world, this one's worth it, I think. Now, the overall presentation to GreedFall is It's kind of tricky to address this, honestly, because visually, if you're a graphics person, this game will drive you absolutely up the wall. I think it looks good for the most part. I think the faces look tremendous, but I want to put a giant asterisk next to that statement because the faces look tremendous when they're not moving. When they're moving, they're really uncanny valley creepy. It feels like their like jaw and like the teeth and everything inside their mouths were animated separately to like their outside of their face, and they don't line up quite right. So it's like when you look at a still of their characters, you see a person. Like I genuinely was impressed with how the faces looked in this game. But once they start moving, it looks almost like a bad animatronic with like a human skin over it, and it looks really unnatural and weird. Also, I would point out that capes in this game, if you're a graphics person, they'll drive you up the wall because the cape physics make them jitter all over the place. Also, they're not even connected to your character, they just hover off your back. So if you're a graphics guy, that's gonna bug the ever-living hell out of you. But you've got some very cool enemies, you have a beautifully designed world, very, very atmospheric visually, and the environments and the nature in this world, just gorgeous. And the sound design of this game is tremendous, the music is excellent, and I really quite liked the voice acting. Like, the main character and all your party members, they were all incredible. And I don't really think I can think of anything that sounded particularly bad in the voice acting. It was all top notch. Honestly, they got quite a lot of talent here, and I'm quite impressed with the presentation to this game. Overall, presentation-wise, as long as you're not into the more graphically fine details and you don't look at the mouths too closely when they talk, it looks pretty damn good, I think. Now, if you want a copy of GreedFall, cheapest one I'm seeing on eBay right now is $44, and that's importing it from Europe. That said, I have seen it available digitally 2 or 3 times since I bought this for about $25, and at that price, yeah, I would heavily recommend this game if you love RPGs, if you love sort of like Age of Exploration type things. But just bear in mind, this is definitely like a B-grade RPG. It's got a lot of issues. It's not necessarily the most well-balanced game, in that it's not balanced at all. It's not necessarily the most well-made game, but you can definitely tell they put a lot of heart and passion into this game. I looked up the developers of this game, and honestly, the only other things I've ever seen them do are like those games that are constantly on sale on Xbox 360 for like $1 every week because there needs to be some sale on there. And I ended up buying both Bound by Flame and Fairy, just because I wanted to support these developers. I love this game. I absolutely loved the world this game set up, and if they want to go out and create like a whole bunch of DLC or like a proper sequel, you better believe I'm going to be getting it, because I quite enjoyed my time with GreedFall. This is a pretty damn great RPG. Definitely a B-grade RPG, but it is a metric crap ton of fun. Yeah, the combat's clumsy. Yeah, the overall main story isn't the most exciting ever, but it's still got some excellent written dialogue, excellently written characters, a great setting, and just an absolutely fun world. I would love to just be able to pop out of the sort of pre-made hub areas of this world and just explore the world as a whole. I would love to see more guardians and more like wild fantastical beasts of this land, because while this game certainly has a metric crap ton of things I can criticize it for, it does have an amazing setting. It sets up a great world, and it's just a really fun world to delve into and explore. As someone who enjoys story as well as mechanics, the exploration to this world kind of scratches both itches, and the writing for the characters and the setting alone definitely does it for me. Sure, there's a lot of problems, but if you are interested in exploration, that is this game's strong suit by far. And if you can get past the sort of B-grade RPG-ness of it, you'll find a lot of fun with GreedFall.
Those conniving, piss-distilling, bridge-building liars. The creature was supposed to be out for days. They'll pay for this.
What the hell manner of cargo are you transporting?
Help! We need ropes! We must contain it!
Come now, let's lend them a hand.